go ahead and get Stephen Myers on the air. Welcome to the show, Stephen. How you doing?
I'm doing wonderful. Thank you for having me on your show. I appreciate the opportunity.
Oh, I appreciate you accepting my or coming on to the show, and it is very fascinating to have you here tonight because you bring something new to this alternative field. Like what we're going to be talking about the next hour, I promise you, like many people in the chat room probably have not heard before. And how did you get into this research about the pyramid in Egypt?
Well, actually, my background is quite technical, and much of my activities has a technical nature. I have the first-class FCC radio license. I'm an amateur radio operator. My degree is related to fluid mechanics, and even my hobbies are quite technical. And I'm also interested in history. So if a person has an interest in history and also technology, they will probably at some time look at the Great Pyramid because it's a 45-story high skyscraper that was built in distant antiquity, and there's a lot of high technology associated with the Great Pyramid with extreme precision and the movement of extremely large stones. So that's how I got into it. And what I discovered is that I tried to understand how it was built. You know, I wasn't interested in gods or aliens or anything else. I just wanted to know how it was built. So I examined what Egyptologists say, and I found out a very interesting thing about Egyptology that is not in their books, that they don't really talk about through my research. And I found out that much of what they say about how it was built has never been demonstrated.
Exactly. And before we get into some of this technology that the Egyptians used and why and how they built the Great Pyramid, give us a timeline of how long ago you believe the Great Pyramid was built.
Actually, when it was built is not the focus of our research, but it was built by a civilization that was able to build it. So all we have to do is figure out that the ancient Egyptians, it appears, weren't able to build even some of the components of the Great Pyramid, like the casing stones. It's that they're so precise that they can't be made by hand, even though Egyptologists say that they were made using chisels by hand, because their precision is so extreme. So probably the Great Pyramid was built earlier than the time of the pharaohs, possibly before the last catastrophe, be it the biblical flood or whatever, by a civilization now that's lost.
Okay, let's go ahead and jump right into it. What is the main focus of your book and your research? Like, because when you go to your site, I forgot what link I clicked on, but you have a page on there that shows how the Great Pyramid was orchestrated and created by using water ducts and stuff like that. What made you have this idea, or how did you come about this information that the Egyptians used water to create the pyramid?
Well, the first thing that I came to understand was that much of what Egyptologists say cannot be demonstrated, that it literally can't be done in the real world, that the idea of a big ramp and the idea of people dragging stones as heavy as 70 tons is nonsensical. It cannot be done. So I looked at alternative ideas, and I looked through a whole series of books, people that said that the stones were moved by people worshiping crystals and all of that. Well, I came across a very obscure book that was privately published by a fellow named Edward Kunkel, and that book was called Pharaoh's Pump. And he came up with the idea that the Great Pyramid was built using water locks, and that the Great Pyramid's purpose was to be infrastructure for the civilization that built it, and that it was a water pump. And that's where I got the idea. And then I founded
the original. Go ahead, sir.
Okay. I founded a nonprofit foundation to develop his Edward Kunkel's ideas and continue on the direction of his research, and ultimately compiled a good portion of the research conducted by our foundation into this book that I've just published called Lost Technologies of the Great Pyramid.
We have a caller that's called in, but I want to ask a few more questions about this fascinating research that you're researching. Area code 408, if you are there, call back in about 20 or so minutes, 20 to 30 minutes. Let's get a few more questions with Stephen Myers about his wonderful research. So where did the water come from, Stephen?
Okay. There's scholarly debate as to the source of the water to the Great Pyramid. Herodotus, the 5th century BC historian, described the pyramids on the Giza Plateau as being surrounded by water. There was a wall around the Great Pyramid that existed up until about the 18th century, and this wall is acknowledged by Egyptologists, but we feel that it was to impound water around the Great Pyramid. But the ultimate source of the water was more than likely from the ancient Lake Maurice, which is on the same side of the Nile as the Great Pyramid. It's much smaller now than it was in distant antiquity, but it's still there. And Herodotus talked about canals in that area, and we feel that Lake Maurice was the source of water to the Giza Plateau.
What was the main reason or purpose of why they created the pyramid as sort of a water pump? Like, what all were they doing with this water pump?
Excellent question. There's a tremendous applications for pumped water. I know I live in the Pacific Northwest, and much of our electricity is from hydroelectric dams. And that's one application of water power. And in the beginning of industrialization, they used water power to power heavy machinery. There's some authors and researchers that say that large-scale machinery was used in ancient Egypt, and this is just one possibility for the power source for that large-scale machinery. And a whole host of other things. You can make compressed air for scientific purposes, and just all kinds of stuff. But of course, the most obvious would be for irrigation above the yearly floodplain. What's interesting to note, just one more point, the largest structure in the Valley of the Nile now is the High Aswan Dam, and it creates electricity, but much of the electricity is used for a large-scale irrigation project. So modern man built a large structure in the Valley of the Nile to pump water. And I feel, through our research, that ancient man built a large structure in the Valley of the Nile to pump water.
Okay, to the listeners, go to thepump.org, and if you go to the left-hand side where it says Key Concepts, click on why or how the Great Pyramid was built, and it will give you a few illustrations in there, and it's very fascinating. But Stephen, I just gave them a link to go to where they can see of how this was built, or an idea of how it was built. Go ahead and give us a brief synopsis of how they did this, how they orchestrated these water pumps into creating the pyramid.
Okay. We feel that the original builders used water locks from the Nile River all the way up to the building site. And imagine, if you will, that the first stones that were set in place were the casing stones, which are the precision stones that used to cover the entire Great Pyramid, but there's just a few left now. But imagine just the first layer of casing stones around set in place, and those stones are cemented together. Well, those stones would impound a pond. So the original builders filled that area with water. So there was a square pond which was connected with water locks all the way to the Nile River. And then the original builders brought stones on barges from the Nile River all the way up those water locks and into that pond, and then moved the stones, the interior stones, for the first level directly into the pond. And when the pond was filled with stones, then the first level of the Great Pyramid was completed. Then they continued that same process with the second level by adding another layer of casing stones, and then the pond in effect was raised up, or actually more water was used to fill that pond, and then they would bring the stones up on barges. And that's the systematic process that was used to build the Great Pyramid.
Yeah, that's very fascinating, and I hope the listeners find it very fascinating too. Of course, the Egyptians had a great understanding of physics and architecture, but how did this technology get passed down to them, or how did they get this technology? Did this technology get passed down from, let's say, Atlantis, or do you buy the extraterrestrial hypothesis?
Okay, whoever built the Great Pyramid, that civilization had geniuses among that civilization. And those geniuses were able to understand some very fundamental things, and they had a deep understanding of physics. They applied that understanding to develop technology to cut the stones, to create a very precise, a very strong bonding agent to glue the stones together, and also the technology to develop a unique water pumping system. And that's what the purposes of the passages and chambers were. And it's like asking, where did alternating current, the idea of alternating current, came from? Well, it came from a guy, Tesla, who figured it out in one day. So I don't think that really geniuses, I don't think that aliens did it, or Atlantis, or anything like that. But I think that just whoever built it was geniuses, and that's where the idea came from.
Do you buy the extraterrestrial hypothesis? Because many people say that a lot of this technology got passed down from extraterrestrial technology.
Right.
Has anything in your research, has anything in your research given you 100% doubt or 100% truth of maybe this is extraterrestrial technology?
Well, the reason why people bring that up is because much of the technology of the Great Pyramid seems to be extremely advanced. So people say, well, it must have been aliens, similar to the ideas of Eric von Däniken with his astronauts from, ancient astronauts idea. But my intuition tells me that it didn't have to be aliens, but that humans are very brilliant, and that humans figured it out all by themselves without any alien intervention. And that's my intuition. Certainly it can't be proved, but it doesn't seem to be provable that it was aliens that the high technology came from. But certainly there are instances or evidence that indicates that high technology was involved in building the Great Pyramid. And
Yeah,
my book talks about that a lot.
The mainstream scholars in academia don't necessarily like to accept alternative views when it comes to the Egyptian pyramids. To break it down, they pretty much believe that the Egyptians built the pyramids with manpower, ropes, timber, and chisels. You know, that to me that seems a little ludicrous. I just feel like there's a little more than just ropes, timber, and chisels, and 100,000 men creating the pyramid. And you bring something a little new to the front, and it makes a lot of sense. And give us another example of this technology that the pyramids, besides the water aqueducts and using the water, what other technology did the Egyptians use to build the Great Pyramid?
Well, one high technology that we think that they used was certainly water locks, which certainly is not a lost technology, but what is lost is the understanding that that technology was used in building the Great Pyramid. But the stone cutting precision is astounding. The casing stones have surfaces that are 5 feet by 7 feet, and they're accurate to within 1/50th of an inch. And that has never been demonstrated by Egyptologists to do that the way that they say it was done. And there's just so many things that the Great Pyramid is evidence of that Egyptologists don't seem to be able to demonstrate, like moving a heavy stone around the corner of a spiral ramp. That's never been demonstrated. And Egyptologists have never moved a 70-ton payload even 1 inch. The entire science, since its inception, has never done that. So that's what brought me to an alternative idea, is the reluctance of Egyptology to enter into the scientific method. But go ahead.
It seems like the mainstream academia is afraid to look outside the box and consider other possibilities and ideas. How come that is, Stephen? Like, well, what are they afraid of? Are they afraid of losing their reputation, or what is it?
Well, people, that's certainly it. You know, they've written their books. They don't want to change their ideas. They don't want to say that they were wrong. There's a lot of that. But, college professors are just like people. They accept what they were told when they went to college. And, what I would like to see is Egyptology enter into the scientific method and prove some of the things that they assert is true, and that would be remarkable. But instead of doing that, they just continue to insist that extreme precision was created by hand, and that just working people could move heavy stones, but Egyptologists who are experts can't do it.
Yeah, and a lot of the issue is, or a major issue is that a lot of scholars believe that, or that they think that we're the only advanced civilization here today. Like, a lot of scholars can't even think of the possibility of an ancient civilization that flourished in the ancient past. Most of the scholars, they're too materialistic, and they're focusing on the science instead of the it's hard to explain, the spirituality and the wisdom and the fight that some of these ancient lost civilizations had. Because when you bring a lot of people together and they believe in something, and like the ancient Egyptians did, and because they were, just as you said, that they built the pyramid not only for then, they built the pyramid for future generations. I think I read some off of your site off of that. Explain that a little bit.
Well, I believe that the Great Pyramid was built by the civilization that that wanted it for themselves. You know, just like we build hydroelectric dams for ourselves, or we build bridges for ourselves, but also their ancient technology, this water pumping technology, is something that can be a vision for the future for us. And we feel that this is a unique water pump that is an alternative to the methods that we use to generate electricity, for example. We are addicted to oil, and this is a high technology that our foundation is trying to develop, which will be an alternative to that. With the disaster there in the Gulf Coast, it becomes apparent the real costs of being a civilization dependent on oil. And we're trying to develop redevelop a unique technology that is a high technology, but it's from ancient times, to be an alternative to oil and nuclear energy and all of these other things. So that's the vision of the future that our foundation has, is to provide an alternative to using oil. And also hydroelectric dams have an environmental impact, and other applications. We need to develop new and emerging energy systems to combat the difficulties that the energy systems we do use have caused us.
Yeah. Well, we have a statement in the chat room that says maybe they were built before the flood and discovered by the Egyptians. Maybe they were built before the flood and discovered by the Egyptians, and the Egyptians built a new civilization around them. How plausible is that, Stephen?
Certainly that is very plausible, because it's certainly not demonstrated that the Egyptians of the time of the pharaohs were able to, do the technical feats required to build the Great Pyramid. There's a lot of people from different areas of expertise that feel that the Great Pyramid was built much earlier by a higher civilization than traditional Egyptologists say. So that's a good assumption. Could be pre-flood or pre-whatever the last catastrophe was, and it could have survived. Now, if I was a pharaoh, let's say in the Valley of the Nile, and there was a great big pyramid over there, you know what I would say? I'd say, I'm the boss of this area, and I take credit for that pyramid.
Yeah.
And that's probably what happened. And I'll bet some of the other pyramids that are quite inferior to the Great Pyramid could have been built as like copies that were adapted for the Egyptian culture. So there's a lot of speculation. Certainly, the chronology of when the pyramids were built is up to debate, and also the varying degrees of quality of the different pyramids indicate that they were built with much different degrees of sophistication. So that is an indicator that possibly the Great Pyramid was built at a different time than the rest of the pyramids. So there's a lot of research to be conducted, a lot of misinformation that is accepted as fact in our civilization to be overcome, and there's a lot to learn that is a more accurate truth than what people generally accept today.
For people that are just now tuning in, we're talking with Stephen Myers. You can go to his website, which is thepump.org, and check out his book, which is Lost Technologies of the Great Pyramid. You can buy it off of his site, or you can go to Amazon and check it out there too. There's another fascinating question, Stephen, in the chat room. If they could build these magnificent pyramids, why did they live in mud huts for?
Okay, that's another issue about they. And our focus is the technology and how the Great Pyramid was built, not who. But that's an important question. In ancient Egypt, there were no cities, really, but all that were left are temples and like religious structures and pyramids. But the cities themselves didn't survive because they were mud huts and that type of thing. That's a good question. It leads one to think that much of what Egyptologists have told us is probably incorrect, because why would they build all these fancy structures but then couldn't even build a decent home to live in? So that's a tremendous question, that's for sure.
There's thousands of I believe it's hundreds or thousands of pyramids in Egypt, correct? Which one is it, Stephen?
In Egypt, there's only about 100 pyramids, believe it or not.
Okay. Were all of the pyramids built in the same manner or same fashion as the Great Pyramid was?
No, they were. Our research is specific to the Great Pyramid, but much of the other pyramids are built with differing degrees of precision and even different materials. Some were made with 100-pound mud bricks, if you will, that just two people could pick up, as opposed to 70 tons. So if one is built with 100-pound stones, as opposed to 70 ton, then they were probably built in different manners, if you will. And some are very, some of the later ones, which is surprising, are very primitive and now are just rubble, while the Great Pyramid, which is considered an earlier pyramid, is astounding in its construction and engineering. So no, different pyramids were built in different manners and even for different purposes. But our research is specific to the one that exhibits the highest technology, which is the Great Pyramid.
Back to the original builders. Why did the original builders go to such an effort, a huge effort, to build these magnificent structures? Like, what did the original builders of the pyramid, of the Great Pyramid, what did they see for the future? What was their main goal, Stephen?
Well, I'm sure they had several goals. One was to have food for the next meal. That's a pretty good goal. And another goal would be to transform the desert into a garden. They probably did that with the Great Pyramid. And they probably wanted to power their machinery, or they wanted to transport water to maybe a temple or whatever. And a lot of purposes for the pumped water, a lot of scientific purposes, and even to operate other types of machinery. I see the Giza Plateau more as a industrial park than a bunch of tombs, if you will, originally.
Yeah.
So there was a lot of purposes. The Great Pyramid, just like a car or a pencil or even a telephone, they're all just machines. And all machines have to be made, but to make a machine, even like a hammer, it's worth making because it's better to make the machine and use it than not make the machine. It's better to make a hammer to pull a nail out of a board than not to. And there was a reason to make the machine of the Great Pyramid, and that is to transform a civilization that was a subsistence living to prosperity. The Great Pyramid was a prosperity machine, just like the High Aswan Dam is a prosperity machine. It turned much of the desert into a garden.
Explain the mechanics of the pyramid pump a little in detail, Stephen.
Okay. Originally, when the Great Pyramid was under construction, one of the first things they did was build the cut into the solid rock down 100 feet to the subterranean chamber. And those passages and chambers in the solid rock acted similar to a hydraulic ram water pump. Similar, but much more sophisticated. And they used the water from that pump to supply water to the water locks during construction, because water locks require a source of water as high as the highest water lock. And the passages and chambers in the Great Pyramid itself, the Grand Gallery, the King's Chamber, and the Queen's Chamber, and associated passages, were similar to another type of pump, which is actually quite sophisticated. It's the Humphrey pump down in Australia. People are not familiar with that, but it used a combustion to create a vacuum which drew water up, which is a very simple explanation of how it worked. It's much more sophisticated than that. It's hard to describe over radio. I give a lecture with a bunch of illustrations. But anyway, and then ultimately the output of the Great Pyramid water pump was the King's Chamber vents.
An argument with many is, if an advanced civilization such as the Egyptians could have built these magnificent pyramids, then how come there isn't any clear record of them being built?
Well, a lot of people, especially alternative researchers that are focused on the technology, they feel that the Egyptians were unable to build the Great Pyramid, and in fact did not build the Great Pyramid. That there's no evidence that the Egyptians during the time of the pharaohs couldn't do it. They didn't have the technology to do it. So it was built earlier. Well, probably, again, before the last catastrophe, and the records for building it would have been back then. So that's probably why there's no records proving when and by whom it was built. So that's my understanding. You know, after at least 40 centuries, we're dealing with an incomplete puzzle, if you will. The direct physical evidence of the Great Pyramid now and the surrounding area is certainly degraded from it was when the Great Pyramid was new. So there's some things that we'll never know, like when it was built and the name of the leader who authorized its construction, those things. But what's important for modern man is that it's an alternative, unusual technology that must be redeveloped to get us off of our addiction to oil. And that's an important issue that we face in the here and now.
Robert Bauval, him and Graham Hancock is one of the people, I think it's actually Robert Bauval, who did the pyramid on Giza, the three pyramids, linked them to the Orion constellation. If that's true, could the Great Pyramid have still been created as a water pump, but also they wanted to link it to the constellation Orion? Well, what do you think there, Stephen?
Well, there's a lot of speculation about alignments and symbolism and all of that. And what our foundation is trying to do, and my research, is strip away all of that and start with a clean slate and just have the least presuppositions as possible. Like the Great Pyramid was built, that's a presupposition, and that big heavy stones were moved from point A to point B, and even if, like, the vents point to stars or whatever, even if that was an intentional purpose, then the stones still had to be moved. The Great Pyramid still had to be built, and that's one of the things we're trying to understand. But you got to remember that everything that points up points to a star. The Statue of Liberty has a crown with 7 spikes. They all point to stars.
Yeah.
You know,
yeah,
I was recently in Hawaii, and the battleship Missouri was there, and the cannons, they're pointing up to stars. And the hydroelectric any hydroelectric dam you go to, the enigmatic passages in there, they all point to stars. So let's say the person that wanted the Great Pyramid built wanted the vents to point up, but he said to the engineer designing it, I want those vents to point up, but I don't want them to point to stars. Well, the engineer couldn't have met that requirement. So yes, the vents point to stars, and people have determined some sort of correlation between that. But the real question is there a causation between the vents or whatever pointing to stars? Is that like an intentional thing? And there's really no corroborating evidence. There's a little bit of people interpreting the Book of the Dead to say that the vents point to stars that are significant, but there's no Book of the Dead in the Great Pyramid. But people say, well, the Great Pyramid was a tomb, so then the Book of the Dead applies. Or they say that the Great Pyramid is the Book of the Dead embodied in stone. So much of that speculation is substantiated by interpretation. So I don't, different researchers have different ideas. There's been a lot of mileage on star alignments and all of that, but I don't think that the intent of the original builders was to build the Great Pyramid so that it pointed to stars for symbolic purposes.
Whenever many people say when they go to the Great Pyramid, they get a sense of high energy and a wonderful vibe there. Since you've been there, correct?
Yes.
Did you get the same feeling? Did you get this high energy, this jolt of electricity going through your body? Like, was the atmosphere a lot different there when you're staring at the Great Pyramid?
Well, I certainly was there, and it's a mountain in stone. I advise anyone that can go to Egypt. It's one of the most interesting places on earth. And but my feeling when I was there was just a sense of awe that real people, just like us, had a goal, and they designed and built this mountain of stone to reach that goal, and that Great Pyramid wasn't just a static device, but it was an active machine when built, and that it transformed the desert into a garden, and it made their lives prosperous. And those are the things that gave me goosebumps when I was there.
The reason why I say that is because I was just wondering if because if that is true, that people get this certain type of vibe and this energy flowing through their body when they're there at the Great Pyramid, could that be because of how the pyramid was built, like because of the mechanics that how it was created inside to be a water pump? Could the water pump be making people feel like this, or what is it?
Well, I don't know. Our research doesn't really deal with people's feelings, but it deals with the technology of the Great Pyramid. What's nice is if people have some sort of feelings, if they can, be involved in the scientific method and kind of demonstrate what's going on, that would be nice. But again, feelings is not the focus of our research. How great big stones were moved from point A to point B is much more the focus of our research. But everyone I know that's been to the Great Pyramid has been tremendously impressed. That's for sure.
Speaking of the stones, exactly how did they get these stones? Many people say that it was carved right there, that the quarry was right there where the Great Pyramid is, and they just carved it out into the pyramid. I don't see that. And many people say that they were shipped across the Nile. How did they do that, if that's possible? How did they move these stones?
Well, there's some speculation about the quarries. There were several quarries. The casing stones, which were the highest quality limestone of the Great Pyramid, were quarried across the river in a quarry. So everyone agrees that those stones were set on barges and moved to at least the catch basin in the Nile by the building site. And then our theory says that those stones stayed on barges and moved up water locks to the building site. There were other researchers and Egyptologists that feel that there was a quarry quite near the building site, but still Egyptologists are unable to demonstrate how to move a stone other than a little itty-bitty one. They can move like a 1 or 2 ton stone, but they've never moved a casing stone size stone on or off of a barge. It's never been done. And a bunch of other technical things they've never done. And of course, the biggest stones that are made of granite are from upstream, which would be down on the map. But anyway, they are about 400 miles away. So the 70-ton stones, everyone agrees, were put on barges and brought to the close to the building site as they can in the Nile. Well, our research says that those stones stayed on barges and moved up water locks to the building site, and that's how they got up to the Great Pyramid. So there's different ideas and about how the stones were moved. And the Erie Canal, I know a lot of people don't study canals anymore, but the Erie Canal was a ditch 4.5 feet deep, and the barges were capable of moving 70 tons. So in the 1840s, let's say, working people could move a 70-ton payload on the Erie Canal. Here in the 21st century, Egyptologists who are highly educated and highly trained are unable to move a 70-ton payload 1 inch.
Yeah, and speaking of timber, how did the Egyptians get the timber to help transport these stones? Many people say that back then, even today, but especially back then, Egypt didn't really even, or the Giza Plateau didn't even have any timber for I believe miles around, even possibly hundreds of miles around. Where did they get the timber to move these?
Well, some researchers, like Egyptologists, say that they used logs to roll the stones on, but on a 70-ton payload, the logs would instantly sink into the sand, or if they were on like a stone ramp, the logs would instantly be crushed. That idea has never been demonstrated. But Herodotus, in the 5th century BC, said that he was told by the priests, which were probably tour guides, that the stones were moved using short wooden planks. Most people interpret that as being levers, but the doors of water locks in the Erie Canal and in other canals, especially in Europe, are made of short wooden planks. So it's interesting that idea of wooden planks existed during the 5th century BC, although they didn't really understand water locks, but that short wooden planks were necessary to use water locks. So that's kind of an interesting, just a little interesting tidbit. Herodotus also said that there was a water conduit, an artificial duct, connected to the Great Pyramid. That's in Book 2 of Histories by Herodotus. And it's just very interesting. There's a lot of tidbits of information, a lot of evidences for the Great Pyramid being built with water locks and being a water pump. An early Egyptologist, Flanders Petrie, in the 1890s, did some very fundamental research on the Great Pyramid, and he found inside of it what he called Nile earth, and that's understood to be sediment. So there was sediment inside the passages and chambers, and the casing stones are cemented together not to keep the pharaoh's soul from leaking out, but to be watertight. So there's a lot of evidence that we interpret to support our theory, and the book has a lot of information and illustrations about the construction process and how everything was assembled to create the world's first and only remaining wonder of the ancient world.
Go ahead and get Stephen Myers on the air. Welcome to the show, Stephen. How you doing?
I'm doing wonderful. Thank you for having me on your show. I appreciate the opportunity.
Oh, I appreciate you accepting my or coming on to the show, and it is very fascinating to have you here tonight because you bring something new to this alternative field. Like what we're going to be talking about the next hour, I promise you, like many people in the chat room probably have not heard before. And how did you get into this research about the pyramid in Egypt?
Well, actually, my background is quite technical, and much of my activities has a technical nature. I have the first-class FCC radio license. I'm an amateur radio operator. My degree is related to fluid mechanics, and even my hobbies are quite technical. And I'm also interested in history. So if a person has an interest in history and also technology, they will probably at some time look at the Great Pyramid because it's a 45-story high skyscraper that was built in distant antiquity, and there's a lot of high technology associated with the Great Pyramid with extreme precision and the movement of extremely large stones. So that's how I got into it. And what I discovered is that I tried to understand how it was built. You know, I wasn't interested in gods or aliens or anything else. I just wanted to know how it was built. So I examined what Egyptologists say, and I found out a very interesting thing about Egyptology that is not in their books, that they don't really talk about through my research. And I found out that much of what they say about how it was built has never been demonstrated.
Exactly. And before we get into some of this technology that the Egyptians used and why and how they built the Great Pyramid, give us a timeline of how long ago you believe the Great Pyramid was built.
Actually, when it was built is not the focus of our research, but it was built by a civilization that was able to build it. So all we have to do is figure out that the ancient Egyptians, it appears, weren't able to technologies of the Great Pyramid.
We have a caller that's called in, but I want to ask a few more questions about this fascinating research that you're researching. Area code 408, if you are there, call back in about 20 or so minutes, 20 to 30 minutes. Let's get a few more questions with Stephen Myers about his wonderful research. So where did the water come from, Stephen? Okay.
There's scholarly debate as to the source of the water to the Great Pyramid. Herodotus, the 5th century BC historian, described the pyramids on the Giza Plateau as being surrounded by water. There was a wall around the Great Pyramid that existed up until about the 18th century, and this wall is acknowledged by Egyptologists, but we feel that it was to impound water around the Great Pyramid. But the ultimate source of the water was more than likely from the ancient Lake Maurice, which is on the same side of the Nile as the Great Pyramid. It's much smaller now than it was in distant antiquity, but it's still there. And Herodotus talked about canals in that area, and we feel that Lake Maurice was the source of water to the Giza world. That the idea of a big ramp and the idea of people dragging stones as heavy as 70 tons is nonsensical. It cannot be done. So I looked at alternative ideas, and I looked through a whole series of books, people that said that the stones were moved by people worshiping crystals and all of that. Well, I came across a very obscure book that was privately published by a fellow named Edward Kunkel, and that book was called Pharaoh's Pump. And he came up with the idea that the Great Pyramid was built using water locks, and that the Great Pyramid's purpose was to be infrastructure for the civilization that built it, and that it was a water pump. And that's where I got the idea. And then I founded
the original. Go ahead, sir.
Okay. I founded a nonprofit foundation to develop his Edward Kunkel's ideas and continue on the direction of his research, and ultimately compiled a good portion of the research conducted by our foundation into this book that I've just published called Lost Tech. Build even some of the components of the Great Pyramid, like the casing stones. It's that they're so precise that they can't be made by hand, even though Egyptologists say that they were made using chisels by hand, because their precision is so extreme. So probably the Great Pyramid was built earlier than the time of the pharaohs, possibly before the last catastrophe, be it the biblical flood or whatever, by a civilization now that's lost.
Okay, let's go ahead and jump right into it. What is the main focus of your book and your research? Like, because when you go to your site, I forgot what link I clicked on, but you have a page on there that shows how the Great Pyramid was orchestrated and created by using water ducts and stuff like that. What made you have this idea, or how did you come about this information that the Egyptians used water to create the pyramid?
Well, the first thing that I came to understand was that much of what Egyptologists say cannot be demonstrated, that it literally can't be done in the real world.